Jen is a psychotherapist and author of 11 books. She's the founder and CEO of About the Author Network. She also teaches writing classes for Story Circle Network and has published essays, poems, stories, and articles both in print and online. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you. This is delightful. I'm so happy to be here. This is my favorite thing to talk about, writing. I love it. Are there any writers in the group? Anybody write journal writings, maybe poems, short stories? Oh, good. So you must know the experience of writing something, and then all of a sudden you think, where'd that come from, right? Maybe you've written a sentence that just was written perfectly, or you had an enlightenment, or something that you stuffed back in your mind for a long time all of a sudden comes up and it's there on the page staring at you. The only thing is when that happens, you know that whatever you've written on the page somehow is connected to something inside you, that it is something that has come up from within you, down your arm, through your pen. But I've just written the strangest book and this is the one I'm going to talk about today. It's Voices from the Land. And I say it's the strangest book because I did not write it. See, this is why I'm not working for the Bomb Squad. Okay, and I say I didn't write it, even though it came through my pen, because these are not my stories, and this is not how I write. So I'm going to begin by reading you the foreword of a friend of mine who read these stories as they came through me, and I sent them to her. She was just thrilled, and she also knew that this was not how I write. So I'll read you this, and then I'm going to read you my introduction, which explains more about this book. So Lisa's foreword starts, "The personalities that come together in Voices from the Land exist in an etheric world that some believe mingles in the timeless space just beyond our five senses of sight, smell, sound, touch, and taste. What allows one access to this realm? Does it indicate a brain that is wired in a manner different than most? Could it be the consequence of a fissure in linear time that offers one a glimpse into a past or future world? Or is it evidence of there being no past, present, or future, but rather that these time designations happen simultaneously in the present moment? Ultimately, the answers to these questions remain a mystery. But one thing is certain: Voices from the Land asks that we suspend our belief system that would limit us to just five senses." And I thought Lisa captured it pretty well. But I'm going to read you my preface to this book. Here's how it began. It was the summer of 2006 in Santa Fe, New Mexico, when I met an intuitive named Sam. As I began to describe my recently purchased 5 acres and adobe home, Sam told me that there were spirits on my property and they wanted me to write their stories. I want to preface this by saying that over my lifetime, I have had many supernatural experiences. In the late 70s, I lived in a 100-year-old haunted water tower, so I don't usually freak out when people talk about spirits. But this time, I have to admit, I was a little freaked out at the thought of spirits asking me to write for them. I disregarded Sam's request until October 2008, when I was looking for something about which to write, and traipsed to the back of my property to a circle of ancient pinon and juniper trees with my camping chair, pen, paper, tea, and sun visor. I positioned my chair, sat, and waited. Within seconds, a story flowed through my pen so fast I could hardly keep up with it. After the first story, I assumed I was finished and began to close my book, but another story came through my pen. The wind unexpectedly shifted, as it can suddenly do in the high desert, hitting me in the nape of my neck and making me extremely uncomfortable. As the wind changed, so did the voice and its story. Thinking that 2 stories had to be enough for the day, I packed up my things and started walking across the land toward my home. Suddenly, I was drawn back to the juniper tree, like a paper clip being pulled by a magnet. As I rode, ants climbed up my shoes and into my socks, but I could not take my hand off the paper to brush them away. When I finished with the 3rd story, a milky white light fused with gold threads rushed up my right leg and with a fast whoosh lifted up and out of the ground. Startled and intrigued, I sat stunned, trying to absorb the beauty I had just witnessed. That night I could not fall asleep. The energy from the different voices continued to rev inside me like a running motor. Somehow I had become an instrument for these voices, and they were not going to leave me alone until I satisfied them. The spirits whose stories I hadn't recorded yet pushed at me. There were no words, just the feeling of a persistent pressure. I promised them I would not stop writing until I wrote all the stories and asked if they would let me go to sleep. It seemed only a second later I was stretching fully awake and rested. I made a cup of tea and walked to a 100-year-old pinyon tree with a wide circle of yucca plants in front of it. I positioned my chair carefully, having learned the hard way that yucca plants are not soft and feathery, even though they look it. As soon as I took a sip of tea, put pen to paper, and took a deep breath, another story pushed its way at my pen. Each day I was drawn to one of the 100-year-old trees on my property. By the 2nd week, the weather was getting too cool to sit outside. I walked into my study where the group of spirits were there, waiting for me. The story started, so I grabbed a pen and began to write. It took 11 full days for all the stories to be written. I have no explanation for them except what I have already given to you. There was no particular place mentioned for the town in which these stories took place, if it existed at all. The only time reference given was the year 1860, when President Lincoln freed the slaves. I got the impression while I was writing that these stories, regardless of place, were transmitted through me for their own inherent value. These stories reveal the hopes, dreams, horrors, struggles, relationships, and desires of a newly forming community in a changing America. These voices were the pioneers of yesterday and the voices of tomorrow for what we are still building. As changes continue to be inflicted upon our world, the courage is needed to endure the continuation of challenging times. It has taken me 3 years to develop the confidence to publish these stories because they appear too strange to be believed even for me. And I was the one who had this experience. But I cannot deny them, so I offer them to you to enjoy, ponder over, and learn from without judgment. Try not to question their authenticity. I have tormented myself enough for all of us. I have speculated about how far an imagination can go, wondering if I somehow made these up, even though I was instructed to transmit these stories to you. The high desert is known for its powerful supernatural energies. In other cultures, this experience would need an explanation, yet I feel a need to offer an explanation just the same. All I can say is, when I sit to write, I do not write like this. These are not my stories. I was not in a trance, as one would think of a trance. I did not feel hypnotized or out of my body. I simply listened and wrote. Sometimes furiously and sometimes slowly while waiting for the next word to get clearer. They were transcribed exactly as transmitted. Any editing made was for the purpose of clarity only. And now these are the stories of Voices from Land in Lamy, New Mexico. And I want to point out that this picture here is the picture of the actual land. CreateSpace did a great job of doing it. I sent them a really crummy picture from a little Instamatic camera. And the mountains are a little too close, but they were in the distance. So there was the Sangre de Cristo and the Santa Fe and the Ortiz Mountains. It was just exquisite. Does anybody have any questions before I move on? No? Okay. So what I was thinking of doing, because if I read any one of these stories, it's not going to have a context, because the context is the whole structure of how these stories fit together, like puzzle pieces. You know, one piece of a puzzle tells you nothing. So what I thought I would do is just read the names of the voices that came through. And all of these people lived in this town and started this town together. A couple of these voices came through more than once. It was like they still had more to tell me. The blacksmith's wife, the stranger and his daughter, the blacksmith, the blacksmith's friend who runs the post office, the cattle ranger, the seamstress, the little girl who wanted to be a boy, the preacher, how the preacher came to town, the feed worker, the horseman, the gossip. Every town has to have a gossip, right? Love and the rattler, the stagecoach driver, the wanderer, the Indian, the man with the big hat, the blacksmith is ready, the Indian makes a visit, not that kind of saloon, the woman who wanted to please the blacksmith seeks love, the young girl and the young man, the blacksmith's wedding, progress, the saddest day, the Indian's last words, and just as I thought after the Indian's last words, I was done, and I put my journal aside, deciding that I wasn't going to do anything with it because these stories were just too bizarre to do anything with. And nobody would believe me, and why bother? I don't know what I was doing on my property, and all of a sudden the blacksmith came through, and he had an epilogue, so that was the end of that. But the interesting thing was when I met Sam, and right before he told me to that these spirits wanted me to record their stories, and I called Sam an intuitive because he was very intuitive. He didn't call himself anything. Some people referred to him as a shaman, but in New Mexico, everybody calls himself a shaman. And I was new there. I didn't know what in the world people were talking about. And so Sam asked me where I lived, and I told him I bought this 5 acres in Lamy, and that even though they were all dirt roads, it was undeveloped areas out in the country, it was beautiful. And I went there to heal from an environmental illness that I was slowly dying from. And so I knew I went there to do a lot of healing. And in the process, I mean, it was such a thrill to walk on. I never owned property before, so it was such a thrill to walk on the property. You know, nobody was going to tell me I was trespassing or tell me to get off the land. It was wonderful. But when I walked around to the other surrounding areas, I didn't get the same feeling that I got on my property. And I get on my property, and it just vibrated at a different level, and I knew I was in the right place for healing. And I met a lot of other people who had environmental illness or who were surviving cancer, and I'd bring them over to my property, and they'd go into this oval circle at the end of my property with these 100, 200-year-old piñata juniper trees, and I'd say, just sit on the ground and meditate or pray, do whatever you do. And I left them alone. And every one of them, if they didn't tell me immediately, they called me the next day and said that that was the best experience they had because they felt like they were healing. So there was really something to this land. So when Sam was asking me about this land, I said to him, every time I'm working on this area, getting rid of the tumbleweeds so that the trees are clear of all this stuff, and pruning the trees and all the stuff that I was doing, I kept getting these visions. And the vision was of a 30-something-year-old man with a white shirt, and there was something black around him. I couldn't understand what it was. It was a piece of clothing. I didn't know it was an apron. So I was telling Sam this, and I said, this man just gives me this heavy feeling in the pit of my stomach because I feel like he's grieving, and what he's grieving is the death of a young woman and a little girl. And I even went out there with a rake. I even went and bought a rake, and I'm kind of raking my property by these trees, thinking, I wonder if they're buried under these trees. Why am I having these visions? And that's when Sam said, well, you know who this person is, don't you? And I said, no. He says, he's a blacksmith. So what I guess I was seeing was the black apron. And then when he told me, that there were spirits who wanted me to take down their stories, that part seemed to fit in, although, I was still very hesitant to do it because the thought of anybody coming through my pen just enraged me because the pen was mine. And when I wrote, that was my sacred place. You know, the page was my horizon. And I put what I wanted on there that came from me and closed it up. And, you know, I'm on my 98th journal or something. I've been writing every day for a long time. But the thought of some spirit or entity coming through my pen felt like such a violation. So, and it kind of freaked me out. I didn't want it to happen. So anyway, this is the book of stories, and you know, I hope you check it out. They're pretty interesting, and it was very inspiring for me because the messages were more inspirational than anything else. Now, for those of you who write, I do want to say that I'm going to read a couple of poems to emphasize this. You know, I've always liked being in nature, and being a writer, I'm somewhat of an introvert and a loner. So I would often go hiking and camping by myself. You know, I used to live in California, so, you know, there were plenty of resources for me to be in touch with nature by myself. But when I moved to the country, in the high desert, it was something like I'd never experienced. First, you have to get used to snakes. I mean, everything else I could handle, but this, you know, I had to adjust to that. And, but it was silent. There was no buzz from electricity. And talk about dropping deeper into whatever, your spirit, or, you know, a sense of the universe, or a sense that we all belong. It was the most unbelievable experience. I don't really even have words for it. Every time I talk about it, I kind of fight to find the right word. It made you get in touch with yourself in such a raw place. And I wrote furiously. I think I wrote 7 of my books there, because it just dropped you so into who you really are when everything is stripped away from you. And now I went there, you know, because I was sick and I had lost my homes and belongings and everything through the disasters that caused this illness. So when I moved there, I really had pretty much clothes on my back. I didn't even have a bed. But so I felt stripped of everything materialistic, but I also felt stripped of everything that I believed in. Every belief got challenged. You know, I see people in Austin, and, you know, I mean, this happens everywhere, not just Austin, and people use pesticides, and they use, you know, toxic chemicals, and I know that we're all raising our consciousness about it, but when you live out in nature and you actually see how everything impacts everything else, whether it's an ant or a bee or a butterfly or something, it really changes your whole belief. It's almost like it's hard to be in the world. And when I left New Mexico, the first place I rented was a condo on Tallwood and Mopec, right at that intersection. I don't know, it's right on the frontage road of Mopec, where 183 and Mopec cross. And here I went from looking at the Sangre de Cristo Mountains to looking at this freeway with this traffic and the sirens going all the time. I thought, I'm gonna die this minute, you know, it was like so overwhelming. But then I started to write some of my reflections just to keep myself sane while I was adjusting to moving into a city environment, which was very tough for me. And I really wish all of you could have that experience, and you would see how your writing would just take off. So there's a couple of poems that I want to read to you just to emphasize how it changes consciousness. Because I thought, you know, I lived in Santa Cruz, California, you know, it's a woman of the 70s. I thought I was pretty hip with all this conscientious stuff, contrastation stuff. So this poem is called Alone with the Moon. In the city, the moon has no room to own a place to glow. It squeezes between tall buildings, dims over street lights. In the country, the moon owns the sky, stretches freely over the horizon. There is no doubt of its kingdom. In the country, I am alone with the moon. This one is called No More Apples. I lay down and cried the day I found you fallen to the ground, your roots eaten clean away by a gopher. I was furious and stomped the ground to punish that pest. And Then I thought, even the gopher has to eat and learn forgiveness. The meeting. We passed each other on a sunny morning where tumbleweeds spread along railroad tracks and wondered what the other would do. In perfect sync, we checked back over our shoulders to see if we were safe from the other, the coyote and me. The last one I want to read to you is An Ordinary Morning in the Desert. Before bull snakes slithered and yellow-tailed lizards did push-ups, I brushed past 2 butterfly bushes, one blue, one white, on the way to take out the garbage, just an ordinary morning in the high desert, and watched hundreds of miniature white butterflies jump in flight against the sharpness of the evenly blue sky. So my prayer for you would be that you get a chance to live out in the country sometime in your life so you can realize that we're all connected, we're all one, we're all part of the same universe. Thank you very much. I was, like I said, I was very young, and I really wasn't up for traveling, but I knew I had to get out of where I was living. It was too congested. Santa Cruz was getting worse and worse and worse. And I love Santa Cruz. I've been there 35 years. So I called the realtor, and I said, look, here's the deal. I'm going to fly out there, and you have to show me places from the minute I get there to the minute I leave. I don't want you stopping for a meeting. I don't, this is really health reasons. I'm not trying to be, bitchy about it, but I have just so much energy to do this. So I had 3 days set aside. The realtor was cool. He said, no problem. So he picked me up at the inn at 8 o'clock in the morning, and we went till like 6 o'clock at night, and then so this is what I did. So the very last house, I had I was leaving the next morning at noon, so he had like one house to show me or something, and we pull out of this driveway, this very last house out in the country, and I said, what am I going to do? I don't have the energy or the resources to come back and keep doing this to find houses. And as we pulled out of the driveway, there was a for sale sign, and he said, well, that didn't show up on my MLS listing. I know, I got the chills, I saw your face. And I said, well, how much is it? And he looked at it and he said, you're not going to like this. It was double what I wanted to make, double. And I knew it was going to be really hard, that I'd have to get work, which meant I'd have to get well faster. And I thought, one thing at a time. Get a home, get work, get a job. I can only handle one thing at a time. So we called the people. It was a person saying they weren't going through a realtor. And he said, I've got this woman, I want to show her the house. They said, well, bring her over. So we went over. And it was huge. It was 2,300 square feet. I had always had a 600-room square foot townhouse. What were we going to do with this thing? But I lost everything anyway, so it didn't make any difference. So it was going to be empty no matter how big it was. And so it was during the time when the banks gave loans to anyone. Thank God. It was my miracle, really, because I didn't know what I was going to do because I didn't have a job in New Mexico. And so they gave me a loan, and a couple of months later, in my little Toyota with only one fit in the back seat of my car, driving out to Amy. I got there, I didn't even know where it was. I had to call the realtor. How do I get to my house? I didn't even know where my house is. They had to give me direction. So it was like the last minute. I had given up, thinking, what am I going to do? I said to the realtor, I can't keep doing this. I can't come back. We got to. What are we going to do here? So I don't know what you call that. God's blessing, serendipity. I don't know what you want to call it. But I certainly don't think it was a coincidence. I think it was something the universe constructed for me. So, but that's how I wound up with my house. Yes?
Could you say again who Sam is?
Sam, well, I called him an intuitive because he was very intuitive. Other people called him a shaman, which, really, I met so many people who were called shamans. I really didn't know what they were. Were they a priest? Was this a guru? Was it, somebody who had magical tendencies? I mean, I really didn't know the definition of it. And so, in my mind, Sam was just very intuitive. I mean, he could, could see things that other people could. I mean, he had an amazing ability. And so that's why I called him intuitive. I don't even know if that's the right nomenclature, but that's how I related to him.
But he was a friend of yours? Or?
No, he was just somebody I met in town. And we got talking, and he asked me, where I was from, and how long I lived in Santa Fe, because a lot of people in Santa Fe are transients, like Austin, Santa Cruz, and these kinds of places. And, I was telling him about it, and I said, I came here for healing, and I felt like I got called to this wonderful house in 5 acres. And that's when he told me, he just came right out with it. He just said, well, there are spirits who want you to sit, in this tree area with your pen and pad and take their stories. And then he asked me if I had any visions or told me my visions. And it was real interesting because if I sat in the middle of my property, I had about 35 trees on my property. I mean, it wasn't a forest because they were small, the juniper and pinyon trees maybe 10 feet tall, I guess. I mean, they're not like redwood trees. And I could only transmit a story when I sat by one of the trees. And it was always when I would feel like I was being pulled to that tree. If I sat out in the land, I didn't get any stories. Make it a bit like you want. Anything else? How am I doing for time? Is it? So unless you have any more questions, I'm going to turn the floor